welcome to Social Studies on January 7th, 2021. Man, does it feel good to say 2021, Mr. Fair? All right. So today we had to pivot a little bit, Mr. Fair and myself. We were going to continue talking about Article 1, and we're going to move on to Section 3, which has to do with the Senate, but we're going to put that on the back burner here, simply because of the events that occurred yesterday. Hey, do me a favor too, before I get too far into this. Make sure you're checking attendance. I got about half of you guys that are still absent, so get on there sometime and make sure you move that attendance over. All right. So Mr. Fair is really anxious to get going here because he's jumping the route and starting to play videos already. So. You're probably aware of what happened yesterday. If nothing else, we kind of talked about this in Viking Hour today, and some of you may be more aware of what happened than others at the nation's capital. So what we want to do, though, is we kind of want to break this down from, a historical perspective. One of the things you may have heard a lot yesterday is the word history, is the word historical. But I think what we need to do is we need to figure out why. Why is this so important? Why did they stop the Ellen Show and Jeopardy and I don't know, Judge Judy, I don't know what else was on during the daytime actually. Why did they, preempt all that stuff and every station had this going? Why was it so important? What was the big deal really about all of this? And I think that's what we're going to try to answer, and that's what we're going to try to get to here. Mr. Fair, do you have anything to add before I forge ahead?
Sure. You were listening to the Nancy song, and we haven't heard the line, teach them how to say goodbye. What you're hearing is that George Washington, who in the news is saying that line. And he's basically saying, hey, you know what, I first teach them on 1789 to 1797, and I'm done. I'm not going to run again. There are no term limits yet, and so he decided, you know what, I'm not going to run. And it was surprising everybody. The line of I'm going to teach them how to say goodbye, what it means there is I'm going to show to the country and the world that I can step aside. I don't need to have power anymore. Somebody else can do that, and we can do it peacefully. And that is basically what we're going to try to do. So we're going to so that song was played for a reason. And I guess the other thing we're going to hopefully discuss on is that people transition to the norm has been for almost all of us.
Okay, hey, it's my turn to talk now. Quiet down over there. I'm going to come over and bop you in the nose. Yeah, get it the peaceful transition. All right. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I think in order to understand really, like I said before, the historical significance here, we have to look back at history. And Mr. Fair already kind of alluded to the first thing that we're going to talk about, and that is the initial president we had, the very first president, George Washington. And I think Mr. Fair already said that he was elected in 1787, but then when he left office, he gave this speech, and we have kind of somebody reading the transcript of this speech, and I think it's very telling in terms of what he knew about politics and how intelligent he was and what he saw or where he saw the future of this country going. So Mr. Fair is going to go ahead and play that. Are those all English words? Like, who uses the words Appalachian? Okay, so I gotta admit to you, this is a lot like listening to Spanish. I'm just gonna pull out words I know and then try to fit the stuff together and fill in the blanks, all right? So I recognize most of those words at least. Um, okay, so seriously, what he starts talking about here, what he initially is speaking of in that clip that we just played for you, is basically saying how fragile a democracy is. Um, and, and then kind of everything plays around that theme of the fragility of a democracy. He talks about how basically, hey, we are all Americans. And then he says, and I can't remember the exact terminology, but he says, but we have slight shades of this, or we have slight shades of that. Basically, what he's saying is, we're all Americans, but we're different. We may believe different things, um, but our commonalities are much, much stronger than our differences. And if we allow those differences to supersede our commonalities, this is where that democracy, that fragile, fragile democracy, could crumble. Later on in the speech, and we didn't play this part for you, but he warns specifically of the differences between political parties. Now, I don't want to say political parties are bad, but what they inherently do is that they create two factions. A faction that thinks this and believes this, and a faction that thinks and believes that. And then, here's the thing. Washington says, be careful of these factions, be careful of these political parties. Now, I really don't think, to be quite honest with you, I really don't believe that he was saying don't have political parties. Somebody will, some historians will probably come out and say something like that. But what I would think he was saying, just based on this other stuff, is that he's saying, hey, we're going to have political parties, but we can't allow those differences to really divide us. If we have political parties, we have to allow for everybody to understand the differences between us and respect those differences between us. Okay, once again, that's my interpretation of Washington's farewell speech, for what it's worth. Mr. Fair, you got anything, or should I keep on moving along here? All right. Mr. Fair's giving me the hurry up sign. But apparently he wants to play that again. All right. So we're going to kind of fast forward. Now, Washington leaves office, right? And then there's an election after Washington leaves office, obviously. And that election is essentially between Adams and Jefferson. And now you have to understand, these guys were polar opposites, okay? And a lot of historians will point out, the first thing they'll point out is how physically they just look different. But really, from a political and philosophical standpoint, they couldn't have been much different either. You see, Adams, he was that Federalist. He's that guy that we talked about before. He's that guy that believes in a federal government, a strong central government. Jefferson, now he's a Democratic Republican, but basically what that is, guess what? An anti-federalist. He is believing more in a stronger state government. So they have that fundamental difference between them already. And then their foreign relations, too. Adams was really strongly backed the British when it came to foreign policies, whereas Jefferson was called a Francophile, and we'll kind of hit that probably later on. But a Francophile was really much more in favoring the French when it came to foreign policies. So there again, much different. So the world's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen here. Adams gets elected, right? Jefferson, for the most part, go ahead, Mr. Frey, you can move it on. Jefferson pretty much gets put on the back burner, and he's what we call marginalized. He doesn't have a whole lot of power. Because remember, at this time, and this is a great system. Our founding fathers did a lot of great things. I don't know what they were thinking here. Remember, the person with the most electoral votes at this time becomes president. The person with the second most electoral votes is the vice president. So here you have two people, totally different political views, and they're both in the executive branch together. So, but Jefferson is kind of like pushed to the side. Anyway, we're going to fast forward to the election of 1800, because it is Jefferson, Burr, and Adams again that are going to run. But here's the thing. Jefferson kind of comes out and says, this is more than just an election. This is a revolution, he calls it. So he writes this. He says, it was a real revolution in the principles of our government, as that of 1776 was in its form. Not affected indeed by the sword, as that, but by rational and peaceable instruments of reform, the suffrage of the people, Okay, so in essence, what he's saying is, look, this is a revolution like we had in 1776, but we're not going to do it through violent means. We're going to do it through voting. So that's how kind of contentious, we always hear every year, and you guys are going to hear it probably for the rest of your lives. This is the most important election that there's ever going to be. Guess what? 2024, I can guarantee you, somebody's going to come out and say, this is the most important election of your lifetime. The election of 1800 is kind of an historical election, though. And it's historic for a couple of different reasons, but really it was a very contentious election at that time. You see, it was because of this difference between Adams and Jefferson, but more so because Jefferson defeats Adams. Jefferson defeats Adams, which means now Adams has got to leave office. And how he leaves office, what he does at this very moment, is really going to set a precedent from now on. So, what does he do? Well, the first thing he does, and the only reason I mention this is because we're going to talk about it in a couple of weeks when we get to Article 3 of the Constitution. But one of the things he does is he tries to pack the courts with Federalist judges. Remember, Adams is a Federalist, Jefferson's a non-Federalist. So he wants to try to keep that political influence in the government. So he tries to put a bunch of Federalist judges on the court. But, okay, so really, the important part here, what does he do? What does Adams do? Well, nothing. He lost the election. So he just kind of peacefully leaves Washington, D.C. Man, this fourth hour's good. Right on this. Huh? Yes. See, my daughter keeps on texting me. All right, so we are watching a scene from John Adams, where John Adams is leaving office, and that is, I think, on slide number 3 or 4. Yeah, you're right. It's under construction. Oh. I thought you were talking about the White House. All right. So that was not the most, thrilling video, but really, it said a lot if you understood the context of what was going on there. From again, that historical point of view. This is where, Adams is just leaving. This has never been done before. Okay, you have to understand, never before in history has one rival political faction taken over for another rival political faction peacefully, without firing a shot, without one being banished or put away someplace. You know, Adams is now just, and it's very poignant that he says, "I'm just a normal citizen now," because that's what happens when you lose that election. You don't get kicked out of the country. You don't get beheaded. You just are a normal citizen now. That's it. So why is this so important? Why is this so important, Mr. Fair? Go to the next slide there. It's really important because, once again, this sets the precedent. Okay, this is really demonstrates or Adams. You know, Adams, I guess you can look at him. Maybe he wasn't a good sport about it. You know, he didn't stick around. He didn't stay for Jefferson's inauguration. You know, he might have been that kid that doesn't get up after a basketball game and shakes hands. He pouts and walks out of the gym or whatever. But you know what he did that was so important is he just handed that power over peacefully. And so he sets this precedent of how a democracy could transfer power in a civilized manner. And this sets the model for every election yet to come. I think that's really the important part here. You know, so now, you know, we have kind of had these traditions that have been built in, you know, along with John Adams. Now, I think that's probably the most important tradition. But other traditions, like, for instance, if you know, one president will leave usually I think it's a handwritten note for another president right on the desk in the Oval Office. And then there's a tradition of what are called concession speeches. You know, if you lose an election, you get up and basically congratulate the winner, and you know, you can say really whatever you want here. But those have become kind of important traditions, especially a concession speech, because the concession speech is meant to be a unifying factor. And Mr. Fair's got a couple of really good examples of that concept of that unifying factor of a concession speech.
Are required. They're not written into. They're not written into stone. They're not written into the Constitution. They don't have to give them, just like they don't have to let a letter there. They don't have to attend the inauguration of the next president. But they've become political, what would be called norms or traditions, because they're very heavily symbolic to this idea of what we're talking about today, peacefully giving over power and showing to the country and really to the rest of the world. And I think that's the thing, maybe because we don't live in the rest of the world, we live here, but the rest of the world does look to the United States, and has for a long time, as the way to do this sort of thing. Because there are a lot of countries still today that do not do this. You know, a person doesn't just give up power unless they're physically removed a lot of times. But we don't have that tradition. So we've had this tradition of doing it peacefully, and I'll give talk about the concession speeches here in a sec. But we do have one glaring historical time that we did not have a peaceful transfer of power. Historical, so not about today or yesterday, but historically. Who wants to put it in the chat or take themselves off mute? When was the one time that power was not given up peacefully, or that it didn't go smoothly after a presidential election? Anybody know? I mean, I know you've all heard of the thing that I'm going to say in a second, if no one guesses. So there's a presidential election, and then things did not go smoothly at all. Not JFK. Good guess.
I kind of like that answer because transfer power between him and Jackson.
So, okay, Grant, we'll get to this here in a second. So I'm trying to look backwards. But Noah, to your point, JFK was assassinated, of course, and there actually was a fairly smooth transition in that his vice president, in fact, was his oath that he swore to be president happened literally on the plane back from Dallas to Washington, D.C.
No, I understand what you're saying, though. You're saying that one person died so somebody else become president. I get that.
Yeah, that's not smooth, I guess. Yeah, at all.
But what I'm thinking of, you guys, is a civil war. Okay, I'm thinking of Abraham Lincoln elected in 1860, and people in the South so outraged that the country would elect a person who had more or less said that slavery should end eventually, that they seceded from the Union. They left the Union, South Carolina, followed by 6 more states, 5 more states, 7 more states, 8 more states, I don't know. And then that eventually obviously led to the Civil War. So that was not a peaceful transition, of course. But besides that glaring example, we've had that every time, okay, until maybe this year. But we'll get to that in a bit. So let's take a look. And the first one I'm going to show you here is George H.W. Bush. Now, George H.W. Bush served as president from he was elected in 1988. He lost an election in 1992. But he was coming off, so he became president after he was vice president for 8 years under Ronald Reagan. And that means that there was 12 years in a row of Republicans being in control of the executive branch, having the presidency. So a long time. He loses, and so he has to give up power. As a sitting president, he's about to give up power. And you can imagine that's a crushing defeat. He doesn't feel good about it. His supporters aren't happy. You know, they're disappointed. All the people who work for him are disappointed. But he gives the speech, and I'm only going to show you a couple minutes of it. And he puts the country first, and he talks about leadership, and he talks about what's more important. And this is a good example of that tradition that we're talking about. So take a listen to this. It's a couple minutes. Oh, wait. Well, hold on a second. Let me make sure that I'm sharing the right screen, and then you can hear it. Hmm? Yeah, it goes back to Washington, yeah. Okay. Literally, I'm going to talk now. He goes on and thanks all of his supporters and probably has a larger message for the country, too. But, you know, again, what did you hear? You heard him. What I find amazing about that is when he essentially congratulates Bill Clinton to be the next president, and the whole crowd cheers. Maybe we're in a little bit of a different time politically, but anyway. And then he just talks about that for America to continue and to continue to succeed, we need to put ourselves above winning and losing. You know, you fight the fight. If you lose it, you move on. It's not easy by any means, but it's necessary. So that one's a really good one. And that one is similar. And by the way, the themes that he's portraying there or conveying are very similar to what Washington was saying in that first piece that we had you guys listen to, right? That we have more in common than we do differences. That we're all in this together, and that we need to put country first, right? And so that one is, you know, somebody losing power. Now, in this next one. This is a concession speech from Senator John McCain, who was a senator who had lost the presidential election to another senator you might have heard of him, named Barack Obama. Neither one were present at the time because George W. Bush was president. He couldn't run for office again because he had served 2 terms, so it was what's called an open election. So this isn't about giving up power necessarily, but this is about that tradition of conceding and saying, hey, I lost, the votes were counted, and I lost, and there's nothing I can do about it. But listen to, the thing about this one, though, is you can kind of, if you're an acute political person, you can maybe sense the difference in polarization. But when he starts talking in his crowd, and he mentions Barack Obama, there's boos. And he has to rise above that and sort of settle the crowd down and talk about what happened in that election. So maybe I'll say more afterwards. What? Yeah. Okay. I didn't hear what you said. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just saying it was pretty interesting how he talked about how far we've come. It's really, I think, in 1900, like I said, I think Roosevelt was not by 1901.
Yeah, yeah.
But he's talking about having Booker T. Washington in the White House and how that was, Booker T. Washington was an advocate for African American rights and how he was chastised for that. And, you know, he got like
108 years or whatever, yeah.
and now,
And so, to that point, you see somebody who not only calms the crowd and not only congratulates the other candidate and puts America first again, but recognizes the historical significance of that election. You know, even though he had just lost, and you can imagine he's feeling really disappointed down deep and probably angry and bitter and who knows what. But because he's a public figure and because he was, and John McCain was a very well-known person, and this was not out of character at all for him. He's very respected, I guess you'd say, and somebody who always put country first. But anyway, he's recognizing the moment and he's rising above it. And he's doing it in that long tradition of, you know, saying, hey, the election's over and it's time to move on. And that's really important for a democracy to continue to work. And so that's what we're looking at. We hope that, so far anyway, you've sort of understood where we're coming from here. That this peaceful transition in power and this accepting of an election loss is really, really important to democracy because it's all about elections. And if you can't accept elections, then you can't really have a democracy. That's kind of how it goes. So, all right. So, kind of moving forward to, I always play that again. There you go. Moving forward to sort of what was going on yesterday. So, it's probably helpful just to review real quick the Electoral College. Now, I did a little bit on this, maybe, I don't know when that was, probably October, sometime before the election. And, but I just want to review that. So remember, the way we elect presidents, a little weird here in the United States, is technically through the Electoral College, right? Well, first of all, each state, and the Constitution says this, each state has the responsibility to hold their own election the way they see fit. They can basically make a lot of rules, any kind of rules that they want about how to actually do that. You know, when to allow early voting and when to, if they're going to do mail-in voting or if they're going to do election day or both. And during this year, because of the pandemic, some states increased their time that the early voting was happening. They increased their mail-in ballot time. Some states had never had it before and then went to it. But the states have the right and the responsibility actually to hold the elections. And then we add up the electoral votes. And remember, the electoral votes, the number of electoral votes that a state has is all based on the population of that state, which coincides with the number of representatives and senators, which we've learned about. So, you know, as an example, like the bigger states like California are going to have, for instance, 55 electoral votes, and smaller states like Wisconsin have 10. Or a very, very small state like Wyoming, population-wise, has 3. Right? And then you have to get 270 votes to win, because that's the majority of electoral votes. And almost all the states, 48 of them, have a winner-take-all system. So whoever wins the popular vote, that's the election of the people, then gets all of those electoral votes, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine. They split them up. Okay, so we count up the votes, then we count up the electoral votes, and then whoever gets over 270 wins. And if you remember, it took a few days this year because of the close elections and because of so much early voting, and the counting just took a little bit longer. By November, I don't remember the date anymore, but it was that Saturday after the election, Joe Biden had went ahead of 270 and won the election, right? Okay, but we didn't really talk about like the technical things that happen. They're sort of ceremonial in many years, and no one really even thinks about it much. But each state then certifies their electoral votes, and this has to be done by, I think it's December 15th. I don't know if that's a hard and fast date, but it's always done by the middle of September. So every state certifies their votes. So, you know, in Wisconsin, the legislature got together and they said, okay, Biden won, 10 electoral votes from Wisconsin will go for Biden. And in Florida got together, you know, basically took a vote, formalized it, and said, all right, Trump won in Florida, and Trump gets the 25, 27, I forget right now, electoral votes from Florida, and on and on and on. Okay? And that's really, once that all happens, then it's pretty much official. But there is one last step to the process, and that is that on January 6th, which was yesterday, the Congress sort of double reaffirms or double checks and makes sure that everything was good. They count up the votes, and they certify kind of forever the election results. It's really almost a ceremonial thing. It's already been decided, okay? But this is sort of like just the last thing that is done. And they literally just count the votes, and the votes come in this big, huge, and they get put in this big mahogany box. It's kind of traditional. I mean, this could all be done online today if we wanted to, of course, but it's in paper ballots or paper documents. They read them off state by state. The House and the Senate have to do it. And once they vote on it, it's done. And most times, in most years, there's a little news story on it, but it's not a big thing. Okay, and it's never, in the past, been objected to very seriously ever, because there's really not any role for the Congress here except for just to sort of what we call rubber stamp it. Just be like, okay, yep, this is who wins. Okay? Well, yesterday, of course, it didn't quite go like that, right? So yesterday, as this process was taking place, now, there were objections to it, which was a new thing. Senators and some members of the Republicans in the House tried to object to some of these things, and they weren't going to win those objections, but they did anyway, because they and others, including the president, had been saying since the election that the election was stolen, that the election was rigged. There is no evidence of that. really anywhere. Well, anywhere, not really anywhere, anywhere. But they took things to court in many states all over the country, and court after court after court, over 60 times said there's not enough evidence to say that this state or that state, Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia or Florida, not Florida, or Arizona, had any irregularities that would overturn the election, any cheating, any rigging, any of that. Okay, but yet, regardless, many Republicans and Donald Trump kept saying that, and people who support Donald Trump started to believe it. And so this rally was held yesterday at the same time that the Congress was meeting to certify the election, and people were over and over talking about how it was stolen, and eventually Donald Trump came and spoke and said it was stolen again. He'd been saying it for a long time, and he actually said, you know what, you guys should march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol and let your voices be heard, I think is what he said, or support those Republicans who are trying to change the election. And so people followed that. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people were angry, and they didn't have peaceful intentions. Some maybe did, but some I'm sure did, but many didn't. And so then you saw the images and what happened, ransacking and essentially causing an insurrection at our nation's capital, something that has never ever happened, with the exception of one time, and that was during the War of 1812, when the British took over the Capitol and burned it to the ground. But no other time has the Capitol ever been overtaken like it was yesterday. And again, it was sure there's I'm sure a lot of reasons why people are angry, but the specific thing that was happening here was people believing that the election was stolen, and they were doing it on this day, January 6th, because this was the day that the Congress was set to confirm the election. Now, by the way, after and you guys know what it was chaos, and there was things broken and glass broken, and it was scary, and there was a person that was shot and killed. There were 3 other people who died of what right now all we know are medical emergencies. Don't know the details. And it's honestly, the way I look at it, it could have been a lot worse. I think we're lucky that not any more people were killed. There was definitely people there who were looking to do more damage, and luckily it just didn't happen. So after all of that happened, and after many hours of the police having to get everybody out and stuff, eventually the Congress got back to their work, and they did end up confirming, I think it ended last night. I went to bed eventually. 3 a.m.? Okay. They confirmed all the votes, and the process is now finally over, and Joe Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th. So that's kind of the story. We wanted to, again, give you the reason, and I think I said this in the beginning, that the norm is to do this in a peaceful way. Yesterday was, like I said, never happened, outside the norm, and hopefully won't happen again, because that was pretty undemocratic of what happened there. So if any of you have any questions, though, or thoughts or comments, we got about 5 minutes, so feel free to put something in the chat or take yourself off mute if there's anything you want to know, if you left anything out or anything you're not sure about. As you're maybe thinking about what question you're going to ask, I'll say the other story of yesterday, I think, is, and we can put this in historical perspective too, although I won't go into it much now, but when leaders say things that aren't true to a group of people that follow that leader, and they say it over and over and over again, bad things, a lot of times throughout history, bad things have come from that, and violence. And that's the sad thing that we saw yesterday. Gwen, they didn't get into the White House, they got into the Capitol, but I understand your question. 2 different places, right? Yeah, that's a question, a great question, though,
Okay.
that people are going to be answering or looking into.
So, well, that's exactly right. So I don't know I don't know where you want to go with this. And we're actually going to kind of talk about that a little bit today during lunch hour. But as much as I know, and I saw this footage over and over. So basically what happened was the Capitol Police set up a perimeter along the stairs of the bottom stairs of the Capitol building, and they were strung out once they breached that second perimeter, they were able to get into the doors, answer the break in. As a matter of fact, the individual who was shot, he was actually shot climbing through a window.
You know, and I just saw today actually that the sergeant at arms, which is sort of the person in charge of security at the Capitol building, has offered his resignation, or her resignation. It might be a woman actually, and the Capitol police chief. So I don't. They're a little bit different. Has been asked to resign by the Speaker of the House. So there's going to be. Now they did mention, and I'm sure that this is definitely true, that they were doing their best. You know, like a lot of them were doing their best to keep the members safe. You know, but there was some strategic issues and some lack of preparation that I think will be looked into for a long time. Yeah, there were people who. Yeah, that's why we kind of know by the images that not all these people were peaceful, right? You don't come peacefully with battering rams and pipes, and I mean there were explosive devices that were found too, and there were people with guns. So not all people were there for peaceful reasons, obviously. Anybody else? Yeah, that is the question, Tatum. I think that is the question going forward. In the immediate question, there's a lot of other bigger philosophical issues going on here, but yeah, how do we make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again in the next 2 weeks? And will these supporters of Trump come back? You could only imagine now that the presence of National Guard and police will be very heavy. And the other thing, I guess that's maybe a good thing, is that there's not going to be a typical inauguration because of the pandemic, so there's not going to be a huge crowd. They are going to have the inauguration outside, at least that was the plan, because actually if you noticed, a lot of the these rioters were like crawling up the scaffolding of like the big stages that are built at the Capitol for the inauguration. They were actually on those. So anyway, they are going to have an inauguration outside. It's going to be scaled back. I don't think there's going to be a parade. And this is all pandemic related. So maybe that's, in this way, a little bit of a silver lining. I don't know. But yeah, I hope they're thinking, I'm sure people are thinking about that and worried about that, Tatum.
If not, probably will shortly. It will be shortly.
Oh, did someone say something?
Yeah.
I didn't hear what.
Okay. So, Tatum, I don't know about you know what, and that's funny, that picture you're talking about, leave it for her to bring it up quick. The picture of the guy, who broke in post office, first two up. I kind of told that one today, because I wasn't who was talking, I think that's that's going to be the iconic picture.
Or the Confederate flag.
The guy that's sitting in post office is beat up. And if he hasn't got arrested yet, he won't be. That's this is a picture that Tatum was referring to. Yeah, these are riders go to jail. Glenn, yeah, they actually had buses after the police had after the National Guard had come in, and they reset a perimeter, and this is well away from the actual Capitol building itself. They secured that perimeter with buses, and the buses actually acted as a makeshift jail. Now, I didn't actually hear what he was getting arrested with, but they weren't for the buses, and that's what they were using it for. My assumption is that he had something to do with it.
Yeah, I saw a number of, I think, 56. That was, oh, you were muted that whole time. So I'll try to recap what Mr. Ginter just said. But they used, I don't know if you saw these images, but these huge buses came in, and they kind of helped as like a blockade, as a perimeter, and then they used them as like makeshift jails. I think I saw a number that they had arrested 56 people. I saw people talking about, and security people actually, talking about how that was a very low number for the amount of people. But again, I think this was because they were not prepared for this. And so when you're just trying to defend and keep people safe, you take resources away if you make arrests and have to go like hold them somewhere, because then you're taking a police officer out of the danger zone, so to speak. So anything else? Good questions though, you guys.
Tatum, before you, the person
Oh, Tatum, your question. Did that person get arrested? I don't know if he has yet, but I would think with facial recognition and things like that, that those people that are on cameras and stuff and take pictures of themselves, which is really dumb, will be, hopefully. I only hope, I guess, that they will be. All right, yeah, you guys, it is past our time, so if you want to go, you can, of course. Many of you have. If you want to stay around, you can ask questions.
You know, that video next to the class.
Right. I know, like, so you can go off and get some chips or something? Why didn't they just call the National Guard in the middle when they realized film? Hey Marley, good question. And I think that's a question that I don't have an answer to. That's going to be reviewed and looked into. Because I was saying this to Mr. Ginter this morning, it takes a long time or a while to walk from where that rally was to the Capitol, and I would assume people knew that there were a lot of angry people at that rally, and that they could have called up more, if not National Guard, but more DC police and stuff. So that's a really good question, and they should have been more prepared. I think everyone kind of thinks that now. Good question.